A quiet night, and a shocking tragedy. It was a cold and crisp night in March of 1998. Manhattan's Upper West Side, often described as the epitome of exclusivity and luxury, was its usual self, serene, polished, and safe. The neighborhood, lined with historic brownstones and high-rise luxury apartments, was a symbol of both wealth and security. The streets were illuminated by warm, golden streetlights, and the occasional hum of a passing taxi was the only sound breaking through the night's stillness. For everyone who called the Upper West Side home, it was just another ordinary evening, the kind that demanded no second thought about locked doors or safety concerns. Yet, within the walls of one prestigious high-rise residential building, trouble was quietly brewing. On the 30th floor of the gleaming tower nestled far above the noise and chaos of the city, there was a world that seemed immune to the dangers lurking in New York's underbelly. The well-heeled residents prided themselves on their gated sanctuary, complete with round-the-clock doormen, high-tech security cameras, and layers of privilege that seemed impenetrable to any outside harm. This building was the kind of place where politicians, celebrities, and investment moguls sipped fine wine from their panoramic balconies, overlooking the glittering lights of the city below. But on that fateful night, beneath this outwardly perfect facade, something chilling occurred that would shatter the illusion of safety forever. At precisely 11:45 p.m., a piercing scream erupted from one of the upper floors, shaking the tranquility of the block. Unlike the muffled cries of domestic arguments or the occasional sound of drunken laughter that might surface on a weekend, this was different. It was the kind of scream that sent shivers down your spine, primal and unmistakably filled with terror. Before anyone could react, the cry was abruptly silenced, leaving an unsettling void in its wake. The tenants dismissed it initially. After all, this was New York City, a city known for its noise, its chaos, and its occasional distractions. Perhaps it was just a boisterous TV argument playing out a little too enthusiastically behind closed doors. What harm could touch a fortress like theirs? That uneasy assumption persisted until the following morning. At 7 a.m., the overnight doorman, tired from a quiet shift, was relieved by the daytime staff. As the morning sun rose over the Hudson River, life in the tower resumed its elegant rhythm. Tenants ordered coffee deliveries, gym-goers made their way to the building's state-of-the-art fitness center, and the housekeeping staff diligently polished the building's marble floors. No one had any inkling of the nightmare that lay concealed in apartment 30B. It was only when a concerned housekeeper knocked on the thick, soundproofed mahogany door of Sarah Collins's apartment that the horrific discovery was made. Sarah Collins, a beloved morning show host whose smile once charmed millions of viewers across America, lay motionless on the floor of her lavish living room. Her perfectly curated life, filled with glittering gala appearances and front-page magazine spreads, had come to an abrupt and violent end. Her chestnut brown hair was in disarray, her iconic face bruised and battered in a way that seemed almost sacrilegious. Clad in a silk nightgown which was now torn and wrinkled, she lay surrounded by shards of glass from a toppled vase and splatters of blood that told the story of a desperate fight. Her once bright eyes were open, staring lifelessly toward the ornate chandelier which now seemed to mock the lifeless silence that filled the room. By the time NYPD detectives arrived, the building's tenants were buzzing with an uneasy sense of betrayal. Their sanctuary, their fortress, had been breached in the most grotesque way possible. The awkward small talk of the elevator lobby was replaced with whispered theories and hushed speculation. "How could this have happened here?" asked one well-dressed woman holding her toy poodle close. "I thought we had the best security in Manhattan," muttered another resident, his tone equal parts indignation and disbelief. Detectives quickly made their way through the building, setting up a perimeter and scaling back access to the crime scene. The media caught wind of the incident within hours, and before long, reporters were swarming the front entrance of the residence, reporters eager to break the story of what would be branded as one of New York's most sensational crimes of the late 1990s. Paparazzi cameras flashed as tenants ducked into limousines and cabs, desperate to avoid getting dragged into the growing spectacle. But back inside apartment 30B, amid the shimmering skyscrapers and glitz of Manhattan life, the investigators stood at the heart of a far darker narrative. The city may have been a land of dreams for many, but for Sarah Collins, it had become the site of her last horrifying nightmare. What could have led to such a chilling scene in a place hailed as a bastion of safety? What secrets did Sarah Collins hide behind her flawless public persona, And more troublingly, who could have been bold and callous enough to bring this tragedy to life? The mysterious crime scene. When Detective Jacobs stepped into apartment 30B that morning, the sharp aroma of copper hit him instantly. It was the unmistakable scent of blood, faint but lingering. The blinds in the living room were still drawn, casting dramatic shadows over the otherwise pristine interior of Sarah Collins' penthouse. The apartment was exactly what you'd imagine for a rising star of New York television, cultured, expensive, and curated to Pinterest-level perfection. But there, right in the heart of it, was chaos. Sarah's body lay sprawled near the center of the living room floor, framed tragically by the mess surrounding her. A toppled vase had shattered onto the glossy hardwood, its sharp shards glinting under the afternoon light as if pointing accusingly toward the horror that had unfolded. An area rug that once seemed intentionally out of place now sat scrunched and bunched, evidence of some violent struggle that began and ended with Sarah Collins. Detective Reed, standing nearby, gently crouched next to the body for an initial glance. "She's got defensive wounds," he murmured, nodding towards her arms. Long, faint scratch marks ran along the inside of her twitched fingers as though she had grabbed at something, or someone, with every ounce of strength left in her. No question, she fought back. But for all the signs of her resistance, the fight had ended swiftly and decisively. The coroner arrived shortly after, his exploratory tools in hand, and began his preliminary examination. "Manual strangulation," he announced grimly, motioning towards Sarah's neck. Deep, blunt force bruises kissed her throat like grim mementos of her final moments. Already beginning to form were the distinct impressions of what appeared to be large hands, a killer who had likely overpowered her by sheer size and force. Her silk nightgown told an equally harrowing story. Despite its luxuriously soft texture, it hung disheveled, torn slightly at the shoulders, and stained faintly near its hem. Though whispers of assault might jump to mind, the room provided no evidence of sexual violence. It was puzzling and strangely clinical. Her attire disturbed, but not violated. Her body marred but not brutalized beyond control. "This wasn't rage," Jacobs muttered aloud, more to himself than anyone else. "Whoever did this knew what they wanted. She's down fast, efficient almost." As he said it though, a flicker of doubt crept into his voice. If this was efficiency, then the scattered scene around her stood oddly against it. Why the overturned vase? Why the deep scratch on her mahogany coffee table as if heavy shoes had stood atop it? There was control, and then there wasn't. Equally baffling were the faint traces of blood across the hardwood floor, oddly shaped and scattered in a pattern researchers would soon realize came from small droplets rather than pools. "It looks like she injured her attacker somehow," Reed speculated. "Maybe scratched him during the fight." The way her fingers had clutched so tenaciously at nothing now felt like critical evidence. The toppled furniture seemed almost staged, or accidental, as though the attacker hadn't planned for the ferocity that Sarah had used in her resistance. A half-full glass of wine still miraculously stood undisturbed atop the side table, a token of a quieter night meant to fade away into sleep, not violence. But the strangest piece of the puzzle lay in the adjoining bedroom. Positioned neatly on her comforter, almost ceremoniously, were Sarah's earrings and a small clutch purse. They weren't thrown or scattered, but deliberately laid down untouched. Was this a signature of her killer? Or simply the remnants of her pre-bedtime ritual interrupted too soon? Its symmetry, with chaos exploding mere feet away, felt deeply deliberate. Adding to the already eerie contradictions, the coroner noted lacerations on her feet. "She wasn't wearing shoes when she fought him," Reed observed while scanning through photographs snapped by the crime scene analyst. "She must have kicked at him based on the bruising above her knees and thighs. She snagged something. Glass, maybe?" The bathroom window provided the final, chilling revelation, an entry point so narrow that its use required both confidence and athleticism. Directly beneath it, the officer showed Jacobs a faint black scuff mark on the ceramic. Probably from a shoe, the young cop guessed. The scuff wasn't alone either. The faint imprint of a handprint near the ventilation slats solidified their conclusion. The attacker had scaled the outside of a 30-story building, not simply requiring determination but intimate knowledge of the structure's vulnerabilities. "I thought these were designed to prevent break-ins," Reed added, furrowing his brow as he examined the ventilation gap. "This isn't something anyone could just figure out in the moment. Whoever this was, they'd been here before, or at very least had planned this thoroughly." But inside the apartment there were no immediate signs of robbery. The elegantly sculpted gold clock above the fireplace remained in place, glimmering faintly, and Sarah's meticulously organized shelves still displayed her vast collection of designer handbags. The crime scene photographs would later show untouched jewelry on vanity surfaces across the room. There were even envelopes of cash inside her closet's unlocked bottom drawer, left unnoticed or simply ignored. Why break into the home of someone like Sarah Collins only to leave behind valuables worth thousands? Jacob studied the tableau before him cautiously, his sense of narrative unraveling alongside the room's unacknowledged drama. "It's not just a crime scene," he murmured. "It's a contradiction. Press coverage and the whispering neighbors." By lunchtime, word had already reached the tenants. One by one they crossed paths in hallways and lift lobbies, dressed in beige cardigans or freshly pressed suits that belied the nervous energy they now carried. "She always seemed so put together," an elderly woman whispered as she exited the building's cafe between sips of espresso. "I saw her just yesterday having a phone call in the lobby. And now? This?" Unlike her polished persona on screen, Sarah was revealed to them almost immediately as a solitary figure, an enigma composed of carefully guarded routines whose final hours barely left traces. "Can we at least admit to ourselves now," Mr. Fraser, a tenant of 15 years and a known loudmouth, said loudly to no one in particular, "that all our so-called security is totally useless? Cameras out of order, front desk staff asleep, what are we paying for?" His accusations weren't unwarranted. Elevators were rumbling improperly for weeks before anyone called maintenance. And now, this breach of sanctuary felt more than inexcusable, it felt personal. The question burned everywhere: how could someone penetrate such wealth, height, and structure unchallenged? The newspapers, once word leaked, would waste no opportunity framing the mystery both visually and sentimentally, an innocent figure of media drowned out by larger shadows seeping into her scripted life. But inside the precincts where Jacobs was revisiting case notes in increasing circles, the relevant theme wasn't angels falling or towers cracking, it was opportunity meeting method. The glaring security gaps. It was hard for the tenants of one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings to accept the horrifying truth. Their so-called fortress of safety had been breached. But for Detective Jacobs, the warning signs were written all over the building's glossy hallways and luxury amenities, even if they had gone ignored by the wealthy residents. This case wasn't just a break-in, it was an indictment of blind trust in systems that seemed infallible but were far from it. From the moment the investigators arrived on the crime scene, it became clear that there were more questions about the building's security than answers. A high-profile murder on the 30th floor of a high-rise might seem unthinkable, especially in a building where penthouses like Sarah Collins's came with a price tag of millions and the promise of absolute privacy. Yet, if this disturbing crime proved anything, it was that even the sharpest locks, the finest cameras, and the most polished security staff were useless if no one paid attention. Jacob's first walkthrough of the building revealed an unsettling pattern of neglect. The lobby, glamorous and imposing on first glance, housed state-of-the-art surveillance cameras mounted discreetly in its corners. But checking the security feed from the night of Sarah's murder wasn't an option. The building manager quietly admitted to what Jacobs would later describe in his case notes as a revelation of gross incompetence. "Those cameras haven't been operational for months," the manager mumbled, avoiding eye contact with the detective. "We've, been meaning to fix that. Budget issues, you see." His voice trailed off under Jacob's sharp glare. Budget issues? In a building where the average monthly rent probably exceeded the cost of a small car, it was difficult for anyone to believe. And then there was the issue of the night doorman. In a building that boasted 24/7 concierge service, Jacobs expected to hear from an alert, eagle-eyed professional who could recount every visitor in and out of the building. Instead, he was met with an exhausted young man who barely looked old enough to work the desk. "It was a quiet night," the doorman shrugged as if it explained everything. When pressed further, his story crumbled. He had nodded off at some point during the early hours of the morning, and hadn't seen or heard anything out of the ordinary. The building's tenants, naturally, were in an uproar when this information started to spread. How could a high-end security team, one that residents paid handsomely for, have been so utterly negligent? "We trust them to protect us and this is what happens," one resident barked at a tenant meeting later that day. "We could be next!" cried another, clutching her designer handbag like it held secrets worth dying for. The breach itself, however, was almost too bold, or reckless, to comprehend. The forensic team discovered that the killer had entered through Sarah's bathroom window, which overlooked a narrow stretch of the building lined with utility equipment. What made this discovery shocking wasn't just the location of entry, It was the precision with which it had been executed. Sarah's bathroom was 30 stories above Manhattan's bustling streets, and yet not only had the perpetrator reached it, but they'd done so while bypassing layers of presumed safeguards. The bathroom's small ventilation window should have been locked by default, but it wasn't. "These windows aren't even reinforced," Jacobs exclaimed as he examined the frame that had been pried open. "For a tower like this, you'd think they'd at least install shatterproof glass or something more secure." Clearly no one had considered that anyone could, or would, scale 30 stories to break in. But the scuff marks left behind on the building's exterior told a chilling story of just how determined the intruder had been. A rope mark near the rooftop fire escape revealed their point of descent. Whoever broke into Sarah Collins's apartment had accessed the roof, used a safety fire hose, designed for emergencies ironically, and rappelled down to her window with a level of daring that bordered on madness. And how had the killer reached the roof in the first place? The answers were as frustrating as they were predictable. "The locks on the rooftop access doors are more symbolic than functional," Lieutenant Reed remarked sarcastically over his coffee during a briefing. Maintenance staff admitted that keys to the roof were routinely misplaced, with several even unaccounted for. "Half the damn building probably has access up there if they wanted," Jacobs grumbled. "Maybe even the pizza guy." Another alarming detail came from the ventilation system itself. Sarah's bathroom vent, which served as the entry point, was meant to be sealed tightly. But it was clear that her unit's vent wasn't installed properly. The frame was loose and there were scratches on the paneling suggesting previous tampering. Was it pure chance? Reed mused. Or did the killer know this particular vent was vulnerable? It was a disturbing question since the answer hinted at the killer having inside information. And if they did, who had provided it? Further exacerbating the puzzle was the lack of any alarms being triggered during the intrusion. Sarah's unit was equipped with a sophisticated alarm system, but it had been deactivated manually by Sarah herself. According to building records, she'd turned it off earlier that evening when she returned home. "It's standard practice," the building manager explained, looking exasperated. "Most residents deactivate their alarms the moment they walk in. They find it annoying to arm every time they leave for just a minute. So we're left with a dead security system, sleeping doormen, rooftop free-for-alls, and residents who disable their own safety measures," Jacobs quipped as he sifted through building protocols. "It's like they gift-wrapped this place for anyone with a ladder and some ambition." As fractured pieces of neglect started coming together, one thing became clear. The luxurious facade of the building was just that, a facade. With a little creativity and a lot of recklessness, anyone willing to scale walls and poke around could have gained access. While the NYPD worked to untangle the identity of the perpetrator, the gaping security lapses in one of Manhattan's most prestigious addresses left a lasting question. If this building wasn't safe, what building in New York was? The realization sent ripples of unease through the tenants, who were now faced with their vulnerability. A vulnerability they had buried under marble floors, concierge desks, and the illusion of exclusivity. And as the investigation moved forward, Jacobs couldn't shake the feeling that for the killer, the breach might have been the easiest part of the crime. "No one wants to think they're paying for useless locks and decorative alarms," Jacobs said to Reed as they left the scene that day. "But I'll tell you this, someone here, or someone who's been here before, knew this place wasn't half as secure as it should have been. Somebody saw the cracks in the seams, and someone decided to take advantage of it." The fame and mysterious life of Sarah Collins. Sarah Collins seemed like the perfect embodiment of the American dream. Born and raised in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Chicago, she grew up in a family that valued hard work, poise, and elegance. Her father, a lawyer, and her mother, a trained pianist turned homemaker, nurtured young Sarah's ambition from an early age. Even in her teenage years, classmates remembered her as the girl who could light up a room, not just because of her radiant beauty, but because of her warm personality and her fierce determination to excel. Her dream was never to blend into the background. By the time she was 22, Sarah had packed up everything she owned, said goodbye to the mundane predictability of suburban life, and moved to New York City. She arrived with nothing but a degree in communications from Northwestern University, a suitcase full of designer knockoffs, and a fiery hunger to make her mark on the media world. New York City, with its relentless pace and ruthless competitiveness, embraced her, or, more accurately, she conquered it. Within years, Sarah Collins ascended the cutthroat world of broadcast journalism, becoming a household name before her 30th birthday. Starting as a field journalist for an early morning talk show, she worked tirelessly, often taking on assignments that others declined simply to get her foot further into the door. Whether it was covering disastrous winter storms from the streets of Buffalo or camping with firefighters during wildfires in California, Sarah earnestly took every gig, her polished smile and infectious energy never faltering. By 1996, Sarah had not only become a rising star but also one of America's most beloved TV personalities. Her charisma, unmatched work ethic, and knack for humanizing the news resonated with audiences coast to coast. As the host of Morning Manhattan, a wildly popular morning talk show, Sarah became the face millions of Americans woke up to every day. She was the first voice heard over coffee, her sparkling blue eyes broadcast across living rooms as she discussed everything from local feel-good stories to hard-hitting interviews with political elites. The media dubbed her America's Morning Sunshine, while her colleagues at the station secretly envied and sometimes resented her meteoric success. But all that glittered wasn't gold. As Sarah grew in fame, so too did the attention on her personal life, a life she worked hard to keep private. For someone constantly in the public eye, Sarah was remarkably skilled at shielding herself from the tabloids. There was no long list of scandals, no drunken nightclub photos, no bitter feuds with colleagues. Yet, amidst the glamour of award galas, charity fundraisers, and late-night dinners with Wall Street heavyweights, whispers persisted about the secrets she kept hidden. Whispers that painted a picture as complex and enigmatic as the woman herself. At the age of 29, Sarah remained single, a fact that tabloids and gossip columnists frequently exploited. Photographers occasionally spotted her having dinner with powerful men in the media or on the arm of tech executives attending Manhattan's glitziest events. Yet, actual details about her romantic life never surfaced. For someone whose emotional candor captivated millions on television, Sarah's real emotions seemed locked behind proverbial glass. One of the more salacious rumors involved whispers of a discreet but intense affair with a high-ranking executive at her network. This particular man, married and well into his 50s, wielded enough influence to single-handedly catapult any journalist's career or terminate it just as swiftly. Some viewed Sarah's rapid climb through the ranks as a testament to her talent, while others spun it as the result of favoritism, leveraging her personal relationship with this unnamed executive. Of course, no proof ever surfaced, and Sarah's many industry awards and accolades lent credibility to the argument that she had earned her place rightfully. Still, rumors clung to her reputation like an unshakable shadow. Beyond the arenas of love and work, Sarah's home life posed offerings more peculiar than the glossy surface suggested. Her luxurious penthouse apartment at the corner of 73rd and Amsterdam Avenue was an embodiment of modern Manhattan elegance, yet starkly solitary. The home, with its 180-degree panoramic view of the city skyline, had no trace of visitors. No photographs on the walls hinted at family gatherings. No evidence of a significant other's toothbrush appeared in the master bathroom. It was curated, cold, almost sterile, a perfect reflection of Sarah the professional rather than Sarah the person. Neighbors described her as quiet but friendly, always greeting people with a signature smile but rarely engaging for more than a fleeting moment of conversation. One neighbor recalled seeing Sarah jogging down Riverside Park with headphones on every morning like clockwork, but noted she never joined other residents in casual rooftop gatherings or community events. "She was lovely but distant," the neighbor admitted. "You could tell she wasn't, settled." Those closest to her, if anyone could claim such a title, revealed an ongoing narrative of inner conflict when it came to Sarah's meteoric rise. The daughter of a traditional Catholic family, Sarah reportedly clashed frequently with her parents after moving to New York. Her father, a conservative man comfortable with predictable routines, disapproved of her career, believing fame would corrupt her values and rob her of stability. Their arguments became rare as the years dragged on, not because they reached resolution, but because their phone calls slowed to a trickle. When was the last time Sarah had visited her family in Chicago? Even her oldest friends struggled to recall. Success, it seemed, had become not just a goal, but her entire identity, and relationships were the sacrifices made on that altar. But what bothered detectives the most wasn't the polished veneer of Sarah's media life, it was the contradictions lying beneath it. If Sarah Collins was indeed the epitome of intelligence and control, why were there threads of recklessness running through her choices? Multiple open accounts under fictitious names appeared in her financial records, leading investigators to suspect offshore connections. Her $10 million wealth, amassed well beyond the salary of even the most successful television hosts, raised even more eyebrows. How does a morning show anchor afford a multi-million-dollar penthouse in Manhattan? One investigator quipped. The giant question mark hovered over Sarah's financial dealings and her life. Even smaller inconsistencies piled on. Sarah's elaborate morning routines and obsession with punctuality clashed violently against reports from her staff about her erratic, unpredictable moods. One day she would breeze into the studio as composed and brilliant as ever, greeting everyone warmly. The next, she was glaring through her sunglasses in silence, refusing to entertain questions. A small rift with a staff member over script edits would send her into a tailspin, according to co-workers. She was meticulously in control on camera but impossibly volatile off it. Detective Jacobs couldn't shake the sense of duality about this woman. To the world, she was a ray of light brightening millions of mornings. Off camera, the light dimmed significantly. Was Sarah hiding her truths to protect her perfect image, or was it a necessity, forged from the pressure of skyrocketing fame? The enormous wealth and financial suspicions. Sarah Collins wasn't just a TV personality, she was an empire. At least that's how the investigators began to see it as they unraveled the threads of her financial life, a world far more complex than anyone could have imagined for someone in her profession. By all outward appearances, Sarah had lived the quintessential life of a successful television host, but the true extent of her wealth, and the shadowy underpinnings of it, came as a shock even to those who had worked with her daily. Her luxurious penthouse apartment, nestled in one of Manhattan's priciest zip codes, was worth an estimated $4.2 million, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. As detectives combed through her assets, a startling figure emerged. Sarah Collins had amassed a net worth exceeding $4.2 million, but that was only the tip of the iceberg. As detectives combed through her assets, a startling figure emerged. Sarah Collins had amassed a net worth exceeding $10 million. That's when the questions began to pile up, questions that would haunt investigators long after her case went cold. Her salary alone doesn't explain this, Detective Reed said, glancing at the preliminary financial records spread across the precinct's cluttered desk. Even the biggest TV networks don't pay their morning hosts enough to live like this, at least, not legally. Sarah's annual salary as the host of Morning Manhattan had been a respectable $500,000, a figure that qualified her as successful but not overly extravagant by New York standards. Yet, her portfolio of assets told a completely different story. Multiple overseas accounts under aliases, a collection of rare art valued in the hundreds of thousands, even a private trust registered through a Cayman Islands entity. I've seen Wall Street execs with less complicated setups than this, Jacobs muttered, sifting through the details. What is a TV anchor doing with offshore accounts? The penthouse itself provided visual evidence of a woman living far beyond what her official career could justify. Sarah's apartment wasn't just adorned with tasteful furniture, it presented an opulence that bordered on intimidating. From original Warhol prints hanging in her hallway to a marble kitchen outfitted with appliances most chefs could only dream of, every inch of her home screamed wealth, power, and exclusivity. In the closet adjacent to her bedroom, detectives found something even more telling. A meticulously curated collection of high-end jewelry and couture fashion, much of it bearing price tags higher than the average annual salary of a NYC firefighter. Emerald earrings glittered alongside diamond-encrusted watches from brands like Cartier and Patek Philippe. Tucked away in the back of the closet, they even discovered a hidden safe, which contained $300,000 in cash bundled neatly in envelopes alongside gold bullion bars stamped with European marks. And if physical wealth weren't enough, Sarah's financial paperwork raised even more eyebrows. Bank statements revealed multiple wire transfers from international sources, some tied to locations as far-reaching as Zurich and Singapore. Combined, these transfers totaled over $5 million, all deposited within the past 4 years. Curiously, many of these wire transfers had vague descriptions such as consulting services or project retainers. It's not just the amount of money, Reed noted, studying one of the entries. It's how clean this setup is. Whoever managed her finances knew how to stay under the radar. What made things murkier was the social and professional context of Sarah's life. As detectives interviewed her colleagues and acquaintances, more contradictions surfaced. Sarah was known for her work ethic but also for her independence. She rarely accepted help from others, even when it was offered in good faith. Yet, here she was, the beneficiary of transactions and deals that seemed orchestrated by someone else, someone with serious connections. One theory began to take shape, whispered among detectives late at night when they reviewed the case. Sarah might have been at the center of something far larger than her television career. "Think about it," Reed said during one such session. "She hosts fundraisers for political groups, rubs elbows with Wall Street executives, and has dinners with tech billionaires. What if she wasn't just hosting these events for charity? What if they were fronts for something else?" Another point of suspicion emerged regarding Sarah's side ventures. Publicly, she had claimed to own a small media consulting business, one that helped rising TV personalities hone their image. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough, even admirable. But as investigators dug deeper, they discovered that the business owed much of its income to just 2 or 3 major clients whose payments far exceeded market rates for such services. One client, a private equity firm based in Miami, had paid Sarah's business nearly $1 million over a 2-year span. For what? That remained unclear. Adding another layer of intrigue, investigators stumbled upon unopened mail addressed to her apartment. Inside one envelope was a notice from the IRS, flagging an audit of Sarah's consulting business for irregularities in tax filings from the prior year. Though the audit had not yet been pursued further, it suggested that even the federal government had begun to notice the cracks beneath Sarah's glittering exterior. The more the detectives uncovered, the darker things began to seem. Sarah's wealth wasn't just unexplained, it had the hallmarks of something distinctly illicit. Was she laundering money for powerful figures she had met during her rise to fame, or was she simply the beneficiary of insider deals made possible by her romantic connections to influential men? Even more chillingly, had her access to the media and the public been used as leverage in some wider scheme? "Here's what I don't get," Jacob said one evening as they wrapped up for the night. "If she really was involved in something big, laundering, embezzlement, blackmail, why kill her? She's the goose that lays the golden eggs, right?" "Well," Reed replied, "maybe she stopped cooperating, or maybe she knew too much." Despite the financial revelations, Sarah's lifestyle had exhibited a strange duality. On camera, she appeared as nothing less than wholesome and relatable, the kind of woman you'd trust to babysit your kids or host a small-town Christmas parade. But behind closed doors, her wealth hinted at a more ruthless version of herself, one who knew how to thrive in a city where survival often demanded compromise. Even in death, Sarah Collins maintained one last enigma. Despite her fortune, despite her connections, her will had designated no heirs. Her closest family members, a distant cousin and her estranged father, knew nothing about her financial holdings, and no mention of them was made in the will itself. Where Sarah intended her fortune to go and why remained a question for both legal firms and law enforcement. As detectives continued probing her financial web, they realized they might be uncovering threads that extended far beyond her murder. Sarah Collins wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a puzzle, a carefully constructed facade of brilliance and control, with the answers hidden among her wealth, relationships, and the secrets she had tied to those millions. The question lingered. Was Sarah's murder an act of desperation, or was it the inevitable conclusion of a life too entangled with forces that even she couldn't manage to control? Whatever the case, one thing was clear: her wealth wasn't a shield. If anything, it was what made her a target. A love life, full of contradictions. Sarah Collins was no stranger to the spotlight, but when it came to her love life, she lived almost as if under an invisible veil. To the public, Sarah maintained an image of a fiercely independent woman, too busy for distractions, too focused on her career to engage in petty gossip about romance. But what the tabloids couldn't capture was a much more complex reality. Sarah's love life was anything but straightforward. It was messy, contradictory, and steeped in layers of secrecy that even her closest friends couldn't fully unravel. Among her peers in the bustling world of New York television, Sarah was both admired and envied, not just for her meteoric rise, but for her ability to keep the media at bay. Romantic scandals plagued most public figures of her caliber, but Sarah's private affairs seldom made their way into the pages of gossip magazines. Still, rumors swirled, whispers of clandestine rendezvous, late-night phone calls, and powerful men whose names were too big to publish. There was no denying it. Sarah's relationships were as enigmatic as the woman herself. A key figure in these rumors was David Harrington, a married executive vice president of the network where Sarah worked. Harrington was older, distinguished, and known for his influence in the industry. People described him as the kind of man who could shape or shatter careers with a single nod. Sarah was, at one point, frequently seen in his company at corporate dinners, press junkets, and exclusive after-hours events. Over time, whispers of a romance started to surface. fueled by their obvious chemistry during off-screen moments. But was it more than professional admiration? While Sarah's colleagues gossiped quietly about the potential affair, no definitive evidence ever emerged. Harrington had a knack for covering his tracks, and Sarah was an expert at avoiding media pitfalls. The rumors, however, grew louder as Sarah's career continued to skyrocket. Her ascension to the host seat of Morning Manhattan happened with stunning speed, and critics were quick to wonder if there was more than just her sheer talent in play. "She earned it fair and square," said one former co-worker who spoke anonymously. "But you can't tell me it didn't help to have Harrington in her corner." People noticed how he always seemed to bend the rules for her: bigger budgets for Sarah's segments, leniency when she clashed with producers, and just this protective aura. It made people talk. Sarah's private journal, discovered in her bedroom after her murder, offered cryptic glimpses into this alleged relationship. Written in her neatly looping script were passages hinting at a forbidden romance, mentions of him, frustrations with their secrecy, and longing for a life unshackled by corporate politics and public judgment. "I don't want to live in shadows forever," she wrote in one entry, "but how do I walk away from someone who holds my world in their hands?" The journal raised as many questions as it answered. If Sarah had indeed been romantically involved with Harrington, or someone else of similar stature, what toll had the affair taken? And more importantly, had it played a role in her brutal demise? Of course, Harrington wasn't the only man rumored to have captured Sarah's attention. Photographers occasionally spotted her on the Manhattan social circuit, dining with individuals from Wall Street, the tech industry, and even city politics. Each photo set off a wave of speculation, but nothing ever stuck. Sarah had a talent for evading the headlines, slipping out of back doors or dodging questions with her signature smile. To outsiders, much of her personal life felt like a carefully orchestrated ballet, a dance between visibility and mystery, charm and deflection. One of Sarah's more infamous relationships, albeit fleeting, was with her ex-husband, Mark Stevens. Before Sarah's life became a whirlwind of early morning TV shows and charity galas, she and Mark had tied the knot in a highly publicized wedding. Mark, a successful but overbearing investment banker, seemed to be a grounding force in Sarah's early days in New York. Their union was initially painted by the media as a power couple on the rise, but friends described their relationship as one marred by fundamental differences in ambition and personality. "Mark wasn't built to handle someone like Sarah," a mutual acquaintance remarked. "He thought she'd settle down eventually, maybe slow down her career to focus on family, but that was never part of her plan." The marriage dissolved after several years of mounting tension, exacerbated by Mark's frequent complaints about Sarah's long hours, her growing fame, and her unwillingness to step out of the spotlight. The divorce was amicable on the surface, at least publicly. Privately, it was said to be a deeply hurtful split for Sarah, who rarely spoke of it afterward. Still, Mark was one of the first people questioned after Sarah's murder. Investigators probed into whether his lingering resentment might have led to violence, but Mark provided a solid alibi for the night of the crime and was eventually ruled out as a suspect. Yet his name lingered in press coverage, positioned as the jealous ex in the court of public opinion. Despite these high-profile associations, much of Sarah's romantic life existed in contradictions. Though she moved in circles filled with glamorous and successful potential partners, she reportedly rarely let anyone close. Friends described her as fiercely guarded when it came to matters of the heart. Even in her happiest public moments, there existed a palpable loneliness that those around her found difficult to explain. "I think she wanted to be loved," her makeup artist of 6 years recounted, "but she wasn't willing to let her guard down enough to really let anyone in. She always had this look, like she was carrying the weight of something big, but she wasn't about to tell anybody what it was." Perhaps nothing revealed Sarah's contradictions more than the empty, monotonous elegance of her home. While the world saw glamour and sophistication, her penthouse bore no signs of shared life. There were no framed photos of partners or lovers, no personal mementos of romantic getaways. If love colored Sarah's life, it existed in temporary sparks, never settling into permanence. For detectives like Jacobs and Reed, Sarah's romantic entanglements became a vital thread in the investigation. Was her complicated love life simply collateral damage from a high-pressure media career, or had it made her a target? Had an affair with Harrington, or another shadowy figure, put her in harm's way? Or worse, had jealousy or betrayal turned deadly? As pieces of Sarah's life came into focus, one thing became clear. She lived in a world where love and ambition coexisted uneasily. If her relationships had brought excitement, they had also brought complications, secrecy, and possibly danger. Her heart was a private labyrinth, hidden behind polished smiles and perfect camera angles, one that hid far more than anyone had ever guessed. The first suspect, the ex-husband. No murder investigation would truly begin without first taking a hard look at the most obvious suspect, the ex. And Mark Stevens, Sarah Collins' ex-husband, was nothing short of a prime candidate for the role. Theirs had been a marriage that seemed picture-perfect from the outside but was plagued by storms beneath its polished facade. From the moment news of Sarah's brutal murder became public, Mark's name naturally began circulating among detectives and reporters alike. In cases of this nature, the one-time lover, the jilted partner, is often the person with the clearest motives for anger, jealousy, or revenge. It didn't hurt or help, depending on your perspective, that Mark and Sarah's marriage hadn't ended on exactly amicable terms. Mark Stevens, 43, was a man who had built his career and reputation on sheer grit and an aggressive, take-no-prisoners approach to business. A highly successful investment banker, Mark had amassed significant influence in financial circles. He was as confident as he was sharp-tongued, the kind of man who could recite stock market stats in his sleep and intimidate boardrooms with a single glance. But beneath his professional facade was a deeply personal wound. The woman he'd loved, and some would allege, tried to control, had walked out of his life for good, and continued to soar in fame and fortune without him. Their romance, at least in the beginning, read like a Manhattan fairy tale. The couple met in 1993 at an upscale charity gala in the heart of the Upper East Side. Sarah, then a fresh-faced field reporter carving out her space in the competitive world of television, had captured Mark's attention instantly. Friends of the couple would later remember how dazzled Mark was by Sarah's charm and ambition, not to mention how her striking beauty lit up every room she entered. For a man like Mark, used to dealing with numbers and contracts, Sarah's presence was intoxicating in its difference. They married in 1994 in a ceremony that rivaled most celebrity affairs. With a picturesque vineyard wedding in upstate New York, and a guest list that glittered with media moguls and financial powerhouses, it was dubbed by some outlets as the Union of Ambition. But as one friend bluntly put it, fairy tales only last if both people are playing characters. Sarah wasn't playing. The cracks in their marriage began to show almost immediately. Sarah was laser-focused on her career, rising quickly through the ranks in broadcast television, while Mark, despite his towering success, expected a more traditional partnership. Mark thought he was marrying someone who'd support his career, build the home, and eventually adapt to his lifestyle, shared a mutual acquaintance. What he didn't realize was that Sarah was every bit as ambitious as he was, more so if anything. She didn't want a life in the shadows, and she definitely didn't want to play second fiddle to Mark's Wall Street dreams. Over time, their differences became more difficult to ignore. While Sarah's fame continued to rise, with her face gracing magazine covers and her segments dominating morning ratings, Mark reportedly became increasingly resentful. His friends described him as irritated by Sarah's unrelenting dedication to her work, often complaining about her long hours, her media obsession, and even her glamorous public appearances. He couldn't stand the fact that she got more attention than he did, a colleague of Mark's remarked anonymously. And for a man like Mark, whose entire identity was built on being the dominant figure in the room, that was a bitter pill to swallow. Arguments between the couple escalated, and by 1996, rumors of a separation had begun to circulate in their social circles. The final straw reportedly came during an anniversary dinner when Sarah had to cut the evening short to attend a breaking news story. Mark, as friends recalled, was livid. The two barely spoke in the weeks that followed, and by early 1997, their divorce was finalized. The split was quiet, at least publicly. Both parties issued polite, PR-approved statements about mutual respect and irreconcilable differences, but insiders claimed the divorce proceedings were tense and emotionally draining. Mark was said to be particularly bitter, feeling that Sarah had chosen fame and fortune over building a life with him. She never needed him, a friend of Sarah's explained, and that drove him crazy. He wasn't used to women who didn't depend on him in some way, financially or emotionally, but Sarah, she thrived without him, and I don't think he ever forgave her for that. So when NYPD investigators began piecing together the timeline of Sarah's murder, it was no surprise that Mark Stevens was the first person they called in for questioning. His history with Sarah, combined with his sharply criticized temper and lingering resentment, painted him as the kind of man detectives couldn't afford to ignore. And then there was the most damning factor: motive. But Mark met the questioning with confidence, or arrogance, depending on who you asked. He arrived at the precinct in a tailored Armani suit, his face composed but far from apologetic. "Why am I here?" he reportedly asked as soon as he shook Detective Jacobs' hand. "We haven't spoken in years." Over the course of hours-long questioning, Mark denied harboring any ill will toward Sarah, let alone any desire to harm her. He admitted that they'd had their differences but was quick to blame the pressures of incompatible careers. "She had her path, and I had mine," he stated at one point. "We were better apart, everyone knew that." Still, detectives pressed. Had Mark kept tabs on Sarah after the divorce? Did he ever resent the success she'd built after their separation? Had the breakup triggered any feelings of anger or worse? Mark responded with cold practicality. "Why would I waste energy on resentment? Sarah was, relentless. She deserved her success and I moved on a long time ago. I have no reason to be involved in anything here." The intensity of his answers and his refusal to appear fazed left detectives conflicted. On one hand, Mark fit the profile of a bitter ex who might nurse years-long grudges towards someone like Sarah. On the other hand, his alibi was, frustratingly, airtight. He had been at a high-profile fund manager's dinner in Midtown the night of the murder, surrounded by at least a dozen witnesses who vouched for him. With corroborated timestamps from restaurant logs and surveillance footage showing Mark miles away from Sarah's apartment at the time of the crime, investigators had to eventually rule him out as a suspect, but not before his name had already made its way into public speculation. Even after being cleared, Mark remained a compelling figure in Sarah's tragic story. Reporters painted him as the jealous ex who had lost control of a woman too big for his world, a figure both rejected and overshadowed by her success. Though detectives found no concrete link between Mark and the crime, some began to wonder, was he angry enough at Sarah to orchestrate something from a distance? Could he have known more than he let on? New clues from a former employee. The investigation into Sarah Collins's murder had already taken countless twists and turns, but the appearance of Lucas Miller, a name that initially seemed insignificant, would soon shift everything into sharp focus. Lucas wasn't just any name in the pile of irrelevant tips that flooded into the NYPD, he represented a direct link to Sarah's affluent high-rise. Before his life unraveled, Lucas had been a security guard at the same luxury apartment building where Sarah lived, and where she died. His connection, however, was far from a coincidence. When Lucas Miller's name surfaced in the investigation, it wasn't immediately under suspicion. Instead, his fingerprints had been flagged by the forensics team after their meticulous examination of Sarah's apartment. At first, it seemed the prints might belong to a maintenance worker, or staff still employed by the building, but a closer look revealed this wasn't the case. Lucas had been fired roughly 2 months before Sarah's murder, a detail that now seemed too convenient to ignore. "That's our guy," Detective Reed remarked as he tossed Lucas's personnel file onto the interrogation table. "A former security guard? Access to the building? Fired in a rage? The pieces are lining up too perfectly." Lucas Miller, 29, was a young man with a record blemished by instability. His employment at the high-end apartment complex had been short-lived but consequential. Hired as part of the night staff, Lucas was entrusted with the keys to one of Manhattan's most exclusive addresses. The background check he passed at the time had been cursory at best, revealing no prior criminal record, but the cracks in his performance began to show within weeks. Incidents of unprofessional behavior, including falling asleep on the job and arguments with residents, led management to issue repeated warnings. His recklessness reached its peak when, during an early morning shift, he was caught letting a personal friend access the building without authorization. That act sealed his fate. Lucas was terminated on the spot, and Lucas didn't take it well. Building staff described him as visibly angry when management informed him of his dismissal. One former coworker recalled overhearing Lucas grumbling about how he'd been set up to fail by wealthy tenants who thought they were better than him. Another described a chilling moment when Lucas spoke about how easy it would be to show them what real fear feels like. At the time, these remarks were dismissed as empty threats, nothing more than an outburst from an unemployed man. Yet they seemed far less innocent in hindsight, especially after DNA evidence began to tighten the noose around Lucas Miller's involvement. Lucas's fingerprints weren't just on file somewhere in the general vicinity of Sarah's apartment, they were found on the windowsill of Sarah's bathroom, the same entry point investigators believed her killer had used to gain access. They were also found on her mahogany coffee table, a detail that couldn't be brushed off. What was someone like Lucas, a former employee with no business in the building, doing inside Sarah's apartment? And how had he even gotten there? The answer, it seemed, lay in his insider knowledge of the building's security system, or rather its many vulnerabilities. As a security guard, Lucas had intimate familiarity with the building's layout, alarm systems, and access points. Those rooftop doors with their symbolic locks, he'd known about them. The ventilation panel leading into Sarah's bathroom, left unreinforced and forgotten by maintenance. He'd seen it during his rounds. Lucas had interacted with residents daily and likely knew their routines, including when they'd be home, or in Sarah's case, when she'd be most vulnerable. He had the perfect setup, Detective Jacobs muttered as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just some random robbery gone wrong. He planned this. And he had inside help, or at least access. But as compelling as Lucas's insider knowledge was, his motives remained murky. When he was finally taken into custody for questioning, Lucas initially denied any involvement in Sarah Collins's death. His demeanor shifted uneasily between arrogance and panic, the guilt bubbling just beneath his skin. His story was full of contradictions, half-coherent excuses about why his fingerprints might have been at her apartment. I was there before, you don't get it," Lucas stammered during his first round with Detective Jacobs. "That place, it's a maze of crap left undone. I was probably cleaning something in her unit when I was still working there." Jacobs didn't buy it. "Right. Because wealthy tenants love having former employees clean their penthouses at 2 a.m. from the outside of a 30-story window," he retorted, staring Lucas down. "Stop lying and start talking." Eventually, Lucas's defensive posture cracked. After hours of persistent questioning, he confessed, though his version of events left detectives wondering if he was revealing the full truth, or just fragments of it. According to Lucas, he was desperate. Following his termination, he'd racked up debts from gambling, debts owed to people who wouldn't hesitate to use violence as a collection tactic. Buried beneath mounting threats, Lucas said he decided to hit one of the apartments in the building he used to guard. He knew how wealthy the residents were, and in his mind, stealing just a fraction of the cash or jewelry stashed in one apartment would be enough to square his debts. "I swear all I wanted was money," Lucas insisted during interrogation. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but then she saw me." The she in question was, of course, Sarah Collins. According to Lucas, his plan began to unravel the moment Sarah unexpectedly walked out of her bedroom. Panicking, Lucas claimed he only meant to silence her, putting his hands around her neck in a desperate attempt to keep her from screaming. But the situation escalated into violence, and within moments, Sarah was dead. His confession seemed to explain some aspects of the crime, but others, not so much. Despite what Lucas said, questions lingered. For one, detectives couldn't piece together why so many valuables were left untouched in Sarah's apartment. If Lucas had truly been there to steal, why hadn't he taken the hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry, or the cash tucked away in Sarah's hidden safe? Was his story about gambling debts a lie to sway sympathy, or did someone else play a role in directing this horrific event? Then there was the issue of access. While Lucas clearly knew the building inside and out, he'd been fired 2 months prior. How had he managed to re-enter a secure facility in the dead of night? Had someone let him in? If so, who? "There's more to this," Jacobs muttered to Reed as they reviewed Lucas's recording. "He's lying. Maybe not about everything, but about something big. I can feel it." One particularly haunting detail increased these suspicions even further. Lucas had never explained how he knew that Sarah's bathroom vent, out of all the vents in the building, was poorly secured. It wasn't obvious, and yet he'd managed to pinpoint it with precision. When pressed, Lucas deflected, mumbling about how he'd seen it during his shifts. But Jacobs wasn't buying it. "He had help," he said firmly. "I'd bet my badge on it." As the investigation continued, Lucas Miller's confession opened more doors than it closed. Was he a desperate thief whose poorly planned break-in spiraled into murder? Or was he merely the pawn in a much larger, darker scheme? Detectives couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone else, someone more calculating, more hidden, whispering in Lucas's ear from the shadows. The confession and complex motives. The moment Lucas Miller finally confessed, the room seemed to shift, the tension tightening like a rubber band about to snap. Facing hours of relentless questioning, Lucas, with sweat lining his brow and a flicker of exhaustion clouding his defiant posture, broke his silence. His confession came piecemeal, bit by bit, word by stammering word, until they had enough to form the shaky outline of what had happened that night. Yet, as detectives listened to his story, one thing became abundantly clear. Nothing about it was simple. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Lucas stammered, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. "I only needed a way out of the mess I was in. I wasn't there to hurt anyone, I swear I wasn't." Lucas went on to describe how, after losing his job, he had spiraled into financial ruin. He had a habit, a vice he could no longer control: gambling. For months he'd been playing games he couldn't afford to lose, borrowing money from dangerous people with promises he never had the means to keep. By the time of the murder, Lucas was drowning in debt and staring down threats from loan sharks who had made it terrifyingly clear that his time to pay up was running out. "I didn't have a choice," he told Detective Jacobs, his voice trembling. "They told me if I didn't come up with the money they'd come after me, my family. I needed the cash fast, and I knew that building, Sarah's building. I worked there. Those people had money sitting around like it was nothing. Jewelry, cash, watches. It's like they didn't even notice how rich they were." To Lucas, the plan had seemed simple: break into one of the apartments, grab whatever valuables he could find, and disappear. He had no particular target in mind, or so he claimed, but he knew the layout of the building well enough to pick a unit isolated enough that no one would hear him. That's how he decided on Sarah Collins's penthouse, a selection he insisted was purely circumstantial. "This wasn't about her," Lucas said, though his shaky voice betrayed him. "I had no clue who she even was. I couldn't care less. I just needed a way out." Yet, as his story unfolded, key details didn't add up. For starters, the method of breaking into Sarah's apartment, the use of the unsecured bathroom vent, raised questions. How had Lucas known about such a specific vulnerability in the penthouse's design? Was it simply something he had remembered from his time as a security guard, or had someone given him that information? Lucas avoided direct answers, shifting in his seat every time detectives pressed him. "I just noticed things when I worked there," he mumbled. "It's not like it was hard to figure out." But the detectives weren't buying it. Detective Reed, arms folded across his chest, leaned in closer. "You mean to tell me that months after you were fired, you still had this perfect mental map of a 30-floor tower in your head? You just casually remembered how to scale a wall and crawl through a vent? Try again?" Lucas hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. It was clear that there was more to the story, but whether out of fear or stubbornness, he wasn't ready to give it up. Still, what he did admit painted a chilling picture of that fateful night. Lucas described how he had climbed up to the bathroom window with a rope he'd secured from the building's rooftop emergency supplies, a tactic that suggested prior knowledge of the building's protocols and how to exploit them. Once inside Sarah's penthouse, he began searching for valuables, rummaging through drawers and closets with growing frustration. "She wasn't supposed to be there," Lucas muttered, almost as if convincing himself. "I thought it'd be empty, you know. People like that, they're always out somewhere. Fancy dinners or parties or vacations. How was I supposed to know she was home?" According to Lucas, Sarah walked out of her bedroom unexpectedly, catching him in the act. The sight of the intruder in her home left her understandably terrified, and Lucas claimed he panicked. In his version of events, he only meant to silence her screams, covering her mouth and urging her to stay quiet, but things escalated quickly. "She started fighting back," Lucas said, his voice cracking. "She was strong, a fighter. She scratched me, kicked me. She wasn't letting up. I had to stop her from screaming. I didn't mean to." "No," Jacobs cut him off sharply, his frustration boiling over. "You had to stop her? So your solution was to wrap your hands around her neck and squeeze the life out of her? That's not a panic move, Lucas. That's a choice." Lucas fell silent, his head dropping as he avoided the detective's piercing glare. In recounting the events, Lucas maintained that Sarah's death had been accidental, a tragic result of a botched robbery attempt. To him it was just bad luck that she happened to be in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But the scene that detectives found in Sarah's penthouse told a different story. For one, much of her wealth, jewelry, expensive watches, even envelopes of cash, had been left untouched, sitting in plain view. If Lucas had truly been there out of desperation, why hadn't he taken anything? "I don't know, okay?" Lucas snapped when confronted with this inconsistency. "I panicked. She was dead and I had to get the hell out of there." And yet, the question lingered. If Lucas was so desperate for money, why had he left empty-handed? Was he lying about his motive? Or was someone else involved, someone who might have orchestrated this entire crime for reasons far darker than robbery? Another troubling detail was the precision with which Lucas had navigated Sarah's apartment, avoiding detection until she stumbled upon him. How had he known the exquisite layout of a space he had never entered personally? And why did it seem as though he had specifically chosen Sarah's penthouse even though he claimed it was random? "All I wanted was to pay off my debts," Lucas repeated, his voice quieter now but no less urgent. "That's all. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, please. You gotta believe me." But the detectives didn't wholly believe him, not yet. Detective Jacobs, his instincts sharper than ever, leaned back against the wall of the interrogation room and studied the man in front of him. "You're leaving something out," he said calmly, his tone almost conversational. "There's another reason you picked her apartment. Someone told you, didn't they? Someone gave you her name, her schedule, her weaknesses. Who was it, Lucas? Who put you up to this?" Lucas flinched at the accusation but refused to answer, the tension in the room thickening with every second of silence. Though his confession provided some clarity, it raised even more questions. Was Lucas truly just a desperate outlier, a petty thief who had stumbled into a horrific accident? Or was he a pawn in a far-reaching scheme, one with players far more dangerous and calculating hiding in the shadows? The unresolved mysteries. By the time Lucas Miller's confession had been fully dissected in the confines of the NYPD precinct, it seemed that the case of Sarah Collins's murder should have inherently felt closer to a conclusion, and yet, for every thread tied neatly into the narrative of that fateful night, 100 others seemed to fray, unraveling into stranger and more troubling questions. This wasn't just a simple case anymore. To Detective Jacobs, it was beginning to feel like staring into an unmarked labyrinth, one with no clear way out. On the surface, Lucas's version of events explained the how. After all, the evidence, a compromised vent, fingerprints inside the apartment, signs of a struggle, Sarah's defensive wounds, all supported the idea of a burglary gone tragically wrong. But the bigger question, and the one that kept Jacobs awake long past his shift ended night after night, was why, one? Why target Sarah? The question wasn't idle speculation either. Lucas made it clear that his initial intention was robbery. He claimed that Sarah had been chosen at random, the penthouse nothing more than a convenient target in a wealthy building he once guarded. But Jacobs couldn't shake the doubt gnawing at the edges of that explanation. "Why her, though?" Jacobs asked aloud during a late-night brainstorming session in the precinct bullpen. Detective Reed, sitting across from him nursing his third cup of coffee that day, shrugged but didn't answer. "You've got 27 other units in the building," Jacobs continued, now pacing in tight loops around the evidence board. Some of them belonged to people with far more visible wealth, more ostentatious displays of money, jewelry collections on the living room shelves, paintings worth millions openly displayed, and yet Lucas chooses her. He jabbed his finger at the photo of Sarah Collins pinned to the top of the board. "Maybe it's just bad luck," Reed offered reluctantly. Jacob stopped pacing and gave his fellow detective a flat stare. "You think bad luck explains how he found the unsecured vent leading into one specific penthouse on the 30th floor? Reed grimaced. "Fair point." The randomness of Lucas's choice felt orchestrated, planned, as if something or someone had pointed him directly to Sarah Collins, even if he didn't realize it at the time. And for Jacobs, that meant the crime was no longer about Lucas Miller's desperation. It hinted at something far bigger and far more calculating, lurking beneath the surface. 2. The overlooked valuables. Someone desperate enough to risk climbing 30 stories and breaking into a penthouse for cash would presumably leave with cash, right? That's what everyone at the precinct thought, until they saw the untouched safe, the unclaimed jewelry, and even an envelope of loose bills Sarah kept tucked into an open drawer next to her bed. Lucas left it all behind, claiming he panicked once Sarah woke up. "Does that sound like desperation to you?" Jacobs asked Reed the next morning as they went over crime scene photos. "Leaving that safe untouched doesn't sound desperate. It sounds stupid," Reed agreed. Then after a beat he added, "But Lucas is stupid, and sloppy." "Sloppy, sure," Jacobs conceded, tapping the photo of the unopened safe with one finger. "But there was nothing sloppy about the way he got into that building or that apartment. He found weaknesses none of the residents even know about. You're telling me he's organized enough to scale a 30-story building but leaves cash on the table?" "It doesn't make sense," Reed admitted. "But what's the alternative, that he wasn't there to rob her at all?" Jacobs didn't answer immediately, but the thought had crossed his mind more than once. The peculiar mix of precision and carelessness in Lucas Miller's actions was jarring. What if Lucas's real purpose that night wasn't cash or valuables? What if Sarah Collins herself had been the target all along? 3. The timing of it. All. Another mystery that refused to resolve itself was the timing. Lucas swore up and down that his presence in Sarah's penthouse was a mistake, an ill-timed robbery during a rare moment when she happened to be home late. Yet, of all nights, it was this one that brought him face to face with her. Reed leaned forward in his chair as he reviewed Sarah's schedule aloud. She was hyper-organized, lived by a strict routine. Hell, half her viewers probably knew she went to bed at 9 o'clock sharp every night. He raised an incredulous eyebrow. And you're telling me Lucas just accidentally shows up on the one night she's awake past midnight? Come on. Jacob shook his head. It makes no sense. He felt the familiar pang of unease rising in his chest. Even her routine wasn't spontaneous. Look at this. He nodded toward the diary entries they'd recovered from Sarah's bedroom. She had a wine delivery earlier that day, something she'd ordered specifically a week ago. No guest list, no plans. Are we supposed to believe Lucas guessed the one night she stayed up late to drink alone? Reed sighed. So you're thinking someone gave him her schedule? Jacob shrugged. I don't know, but the timing feels too convenient. 4. The phone calls. There was one other oddity neither of the detectives could let go of. Sarah's phone records revealed multiple missed calls in the weeks leading up to her murder, all from an untraceable burner number. While Sarah herself hadn't mentioned any recent threats to her colleagues or friends, her journal hinted at growing paranoia. I think someone's watching me, she wrote in one entry. It's not obvious, just moments, cars that feel like they take too long to pass, voices on the street that seem too familiar. It's probably nothing, but it's probably something. Jacobs paused as he read the entry aloud for the 5th or 6th time that week. What did she mean by too familiar? He wondered aloud, as much to himself as to Reed. We assumed she'd gotten random crank calls or stalkers before, Reed offered half-heartedly. Being a national TV star comes with dangers. You know that. It's not just the calls, Jacobs replied, eyes narrowing. It's the way she knew. She felt something was coming. You don't write this unless whatever it was had been bothering you for a while. 5. Lucas's silence. Lucas, as cooperative as he had been about admitting his involvement, had grown quieter about the wider context of the crime. No matter how much Jacobs pressed him about what he might have overheard during his time working at the building or about who else might have been involved in orchestrating the crime, Lucas locked down. I swear to God I don't know anything else, Lucas had screamed during the last interrogation session. But Jacobs wasn't convinced Lucas was totally ignorant. Fear, not ignorance, seemed to drive his reluctance to talk. Fear of who or what remained unclear. 6. The working theories. Jacobs couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas Miller didn't act alone, but the who was much harder to pinpoint. Was it the result of a tip from another disgruntled employee, someone who knew Sarah's building just as intimately as Lucas? Or could Lucas have been a pawn, a disposable tool used by someone else hiding in the shadows? There was also the haunting possibility that Sarah's murder wasn't random at all. She wasn't just a morning show host. She had wealth, power, and connections. Could her hidden finances or whispered romances have brought someone dangerous into her orbit? A case far from finished. For Jacobs, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The pieces didn't fit, and they wouldn't until every doubt, every lingering question had been nailed shut. As he stared at the evidence board that evening, his gut churned with equal parts frustration and uncertainty. This case, he muttered to himself, isn't about what happened that night. It's about everything that happened before it. Conspiracy or unexpected accident? The murder of Sarah Collins was never going to be easy to categorize. Was it just an isolated tragedy, a desperate act gone wrong, or had it been something far more sinister? To Detective Jacobs, the question had stopped being hypothetical. Every lead, every scrap of evidence, seemed to carry the faint stench of manipulation, a deliberate hand guiding events to their bloody conclusion. But which version of the truth was closer to reality? A botched burglary or a carefully orchestrated game with Sarah Collins as the pawn? An ordinary crime or a calculated plot? From the moment Lucas Miller's confession hit, the case had become more of a paradox than anything resembling closure. At face value, Lucas's story painted him as a desperate man with no options left, a gambling addict who turned to crime as a last resort. The bruises, the panic, the ill-conceived break-in, these elements all spoke of chaos, not planning. And yet, every angle of the crime scene, every unexplained detail of Sarah's life, whispered of something bigger. Here's the thing, Detective Reed said one evening as he and Jacob stared at the evidence board. If this was just a random burglary gone south, it ends with Lucas. The break-in, the fight, the panic, case closed. But it's not closed, Jacob shot back, his voice sharp with frustration. People don't just break into luxury apartments without a motive beyond desperation. And someone doesn't end up dead because of bad luck. They end up dead because the situation escalated, or because it was always meant to. Reed tapped Lucas Miller's mugshot pinned to the board. So which is it then? Was this guy an amateur screw-up who picked the wrong apartment, or is there someone pulling his strings? Jacobs didn't answer immediately. That was the question, wasn't it? Everything about Lucas screamed amateur, his sloppiness, his panic, the way he crumbled under interrogation. But even amateurs didn't rappel off rooftops and identify unsecured vents on a penthouse without some level of help, some piece of insider knowledge. Theories taking shape. Chaos or order. The detective team knew they were walking a tightrope. Walsh Academy certified burglars didn't ordinarily emerge from disgraced former security guards who barely scraped by on night shifts. Yet here Lucas was, executing a break-in with an awareness of both the building's weaknesses and Sarah's solitude that raised suspicions far beyond what his panic-driven confession could explain. Jacobs thought about how it all added up, or rather, how it didn't. What were the odds Lucas had landed on Sarah's apartment purely by chance? What were the odds he'd managed to navigate the expansive penthouse building with such precision, only to leave all her wealth untouched? Reed sipped his rapidly cooling coffee, tossing out a thought. You ever remember watching Sarah talk about crime trends on her show? She'd have analysts break it all down, some stats about how even in Manhattan the chances of random high-end burglaries targeting solitary women barely registered as a blip. So for her to be that 1 in a million? Come on, Jacobs nodded, no humor in his response. It wasn't random. Either Lucas picked her because somebody fed him intel or... He stopped himself. He knew better than to speculate too wildly without more to work from, but his gut twisted as he finished the thought silently. Or Sarah was always the target, the role of Sarah's hidden life. What had struck Jacobs over and over again during the investigation was Sarah's public veneer versus her secret reality. To the world, Sarah Collins had been America's image of morning optimism. Poised, articulate, trustworthy. She woke up billions of households with her signature smile and warmth, but what lay beneath had nothing to do with that light. Her apartment, meticulously arranged and cold, was devoid of human intimacy. Her financial dealings were riddled with layers of ambiguity, offshore accounts, undeclared income, a network of wealthy friends whose ties to Sarah seemed as much about transactions as relationships. Tell me this wasn't all coincidence, Jacobs muttered to himself as he flipped through financial reports during another late night in the precinct. She builds a world of walls and power plays, then ends up dead in her fortress, and we're supposed to chalk it up to bad timing? Reed, half hearing him, threw a crumpled snack wrapper into the trash. You think she was into something? I don't think. I know. Too many rumors, too much unspoken tension around everyone who knew her. And don't get me started on her little black book broadcasting secrets through Swiss accounts. Lucas, pawn or participant? And then there was Lucas, caught squarely between these dual theories of chaos and conspiracy. Lucas's inability to answer certain questions during his interrogation was, Jacobs believed, less about ignorance and more about fear. How did you know about the vent access? Jacobs had pressed him repeatedly. Lucas always found a way to dodge it. I just knew, Lucas would stammer. I used to work the building, you figure things out. Jacobs had slammed a hand on the table during one of the sessions. No you don't. People don't figure out intimate penthouse vulnerabilities by accident, Lucas. Tell me, who gave you that information? Lucas had fidgeted, unable to maintain eye contact. No one told me, I swear. But Jacobs wasn't buying it. Someone, somewhere had tipped Lucas off, whether intentionally or unintentionally. But whose involvement pushed Lucas into Sarah Collins's world? Was it another disgruntled employee, someone familiar with the building's weaknesses? Or was it someone higher, more powerful, in Sarah's orbit? She's just the target, Jacobs thought bitterly, his gut twisting again. This guy's small fry. He wanted personal gain, but someone wanted her gone. Was there a mastermind? Reed, tinkering with evidence logs one afternoon, offered another theory. What if Lucas is lying about half the story, like maybe... He drifted off, his expression tightening as he put the pieces together out loud. Maybe he wasn't there by accident. Maybe he wasn't even there for the money. What if he was the distraction in all this? Jacob stared at him, puzzled but intrigued. You're saying someone sent him in there as a decoy? Maybe. Or maybe they orchestrated just enough to get him to screw things up. Control the chaos. Make him think it's all about cash while they take out Sarah Collins the old-fashioned way. He's too dumb to question it. And when everything goes sideways, He's the one left holding the bag. The idea sent chills through Jacobs. If Reed was right, it made the case infinitely bigger and infinitely harder to solve. It also meant that whoever wanted Sarah Collins dead had calculated every detail to ensure Lucas would take the fall. An unanswered question. The deeper they dug, the more Sarah's murder began to look less like an isolated tragedy, and more like the violent eruption of a hidden life packed with secrets. Had she crossed the wrong person, known something she wasn't supposed to, or had her connections to powerful figures, her rumored affair with high-ranking broadcasting executives, finally led her to a fatal betrayal? Each possibility only made the lingering sense of conspiracy stronger. Maybe Sarah's death had been orchestrated from the shadows. Maybe Lucas Miller was just the beginning, the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper than anyone at the precinct wanted to admit. Jacobs leaned back in his chair, his exhaustion hanging like a fog over the room. Conspiracy? Accident? He murmured to himself. We'll never know the difference unless we figure out who she really was. For every answer they uncovered, Sarah's murder had one central mystery entwining it. Was her death inevitable, written into the fabric of the life she lived? Or was she simply an innocent crushed under the weight of other people's schemes? The precinct wasn't ready to stop asking questions just yet. For Jacobs, letting this case stand as just another crime of passion gone wrong felt like an insult to the intelligence of anyone who could see the strings hanging over Lucas Miller's head. And worst of all, it left whoever might be tugging those strings free to target someone else. The truth about Sarah's murder wasn't just elusive, it was surrounded by the kind of silence that only power and fear could enforce. Whether Sarah had been killed by accident, by scheme, or by someone far more dangerous than Lucas Miller, one thing was certain: the story wasn't over. The ending and legacy of a short life. The final chapter in Sarah Collins's life was written in blood and shadows. It started with a scream heard by no one who could help her, and ended in a lifeless room whose golden glow from luxury lamps stood as an ironic mockery. The world that adored her, the fans who turned to her every morning for her charm, her stories, her connection, was entirely unaware of the horrors unfolding in apartment 30B that night. And though investigators had uncovered a confession, tied Lucas Miller to an act of violence, and brought some semblance of justice, Sarah's story remained incomplete. Like an unfinished book, it left a sour ache in the minds of those who followed her case, a sense that important pages had been burned away by forces no one could see or name. Most murders end with a culprit, a trial, and a resolution. Sarah's, however, dragged forward like a wound that refused to heal. For Detective Jacobs, the scars of her case lingered not only as questions about what had happened the night she died, but about what her life had meant to the world, and how it had come to an end so violently. 1. Sarah Collins, a life cut short. Sarah Collins was 29 years old when she was murdered. It felt impossible to reconcile that fact with the persona she had built in her relatively short life. To her fans, she was a symbol of success, the epitome of the modern American dream. From her charming debut as a bright-eyed field reporter to her reign as the golden host of Morning Manhattan, Sarah had achieved in less than a decade what many in her field didn't accomplish in a lifetime. She wasn't just an anchor, her producer Linda Hart recalled tearfully during an interview days after Sarah's death. She was the show. She brought warmth, intelligence, and this incredible energy to the screen every single morning. She wasn't just a name or a face. We woke up with her. We trusted her. But behind her polished public image lay fragility. Sarah's journey to stardom wasn't just fueled by talent but also survival. Her life, though glitzy and successful, had often been a maze of isolation, loneliness, and sacrifices. Her estranged relationship with her family and tangled romantic past painted her as a contradiction, the woman who had everything and yet seemed increasingly alone, especially in her final years. "Look at her," Jacobs muttered one late night, staring at a glossy tabloid photo of Sarah flashing her signature smile at a gala. "She's perfect here. Perfect hair, perfect dress, no cracks showing. But it's all just, what, a defense? A facade?" Reed, who had long since run out of patience for analyzing celebrity personalities, shook his head. "At the end of the day, it doesn't matter how many smiles she gave the camera, someone wanted her dead. That's what matters." Jacobs disagreed. "I think it matters. Someone like Sarah doesn't just have it all, without paying for it in some way. We find that cost, Reed, then we'll understand what happened." 2. The lingering echoes of justice. Lucas Miller's sentencing should have brought closure at least for the broader public. It was an open and shut case for the courts. He confessed, admitted guilt under questioning, and was linked to the murder scene through overwhelming physical evidence. Within months of his arrest, Lucas was sentenced to life in prison without parole, a decision that satisfied the legal standard of justice. But it was a cold, clinical form of justice. To those who had known Sarah, the verdict felt hollow. Lucas, despite his admission, had never fully explained why he chose Sarah. The holes in his confession, his vague explanations, his inability to account for the details that led him into Sarah's home, left a lingering suspicion that someone, somewhere, had played a hand in directing him to her. To Jacobs, every piece of evidence Lucas left behind screamed that the man was part of something larger, whether he knew it or not. "The people who loved her won't forget Lucas's name," Reed said as they left the courtroom after the sentencing hearing. "But the people who hated her? They're still out there, Jacobs. Don't act like you don't feel it too." Jacobs didn't respond and instead turned his mind to a piece of Sarah's case he hated the most, the possibility that they had missed something. Lucas Miller may have been a violent, desperate man, but he wasn't a puppet master. The cracks in Sarah's world, the fears hinted at in her journal, the strange behaviors in her final weeks, all carried the weight of a deeper story. 3. The shadows of power and secrets. As Sarah's name slowly began to fade from the media frenzy surrounding her death, whispers grew louder in the upper echelons of New York's elite. The very same people who had once toasted her at galas seemed uncharacteristically quiet about the tragedy. Sarah's connections to powerful figures, high-ranking media executives, Wall Street entrepreneurs, and tech billionaires made her more than a TV anchor. She had become an insider to the city's most influential circles. She had hosted their events, raised millions for their causes, and rubbed shoulders with their darkest ambitions. That Sarah knew secrets no one wanted revealed wasn't speculation, it was fact. Her finances, her offshore accounts, her unheard conversations locked away in her emails, they all pointed to a woman who had danced too close to power. Some detectives suggested after her death that perhaps Sarah had inadvertently stumbled upon something, a deal, a scandal, something she wasn't intended to see. And yet, despite whispers of conspiracies, no significant evidence tying Sarah's murder to anything larger ever emerged. Never officially, at least. "We'd never find it even if it was there," Jacobs admitted bitterly one night to Reed. "People at that level don't leave trails. That's why guys like Lucas get used. They roll in and out like disposable napkins." 4. What she left behind. For all the noise surrounding her death, Sarah's legacy is what continued to haunt those closest to her. To her fans, Morning Manhattan would never again capture the spark it had with Sarah behind the anchor desk. Her absence from their morning routines made the world just a little dimmer, colder. Her wealth, too, massive and shrouded in suspicion, became the subject of fierce legal battles in the months following her death. Her father, estranged for years, emerged from obscurity to contest parts of her will, claiming ignorance of her immense fortune. Charities Sarah had supported quietly questioned whether her donations had all been from clean sources. Banks and attorneys peeled through years of transactions in search of clarity, and found almost none. "She left a hell of a mess behind," Reed remarked, scrolling through updates one morning. "She left everything behind," Jacobs replied, shaking his head. "We still don't even know who she really was, do we?" 5. The question that wouldn't die. As months turned to years, one question remained. Was Sarah Collins killed because of her fame, her wealth, or because she simply lived in a world too dangerous for someone like her to navigate forever? Maybe Lucas Miller was simply a desperate man who lost control, maybe. Or maybe he was merely the instrument of something far less random, a plan too dark and vast to ever see the light. One night, sitting alone at his desk, Detective Jacobs stared at Sarah's photo one last time. The photo was one of her smiling at a charity marathon, the city skyline stretching behind her. She looked glowing, upbeat, alive. "You deserve better than this," Jacobs muttered under his breath. He closed the file for now, but not forever. The secrets of Sarah Collins's short but extraordinary life weren't finished unraveling, and Jacobs couldn't shake the feeling that even years later the truth was still out there, waiting. Sarah Collins, in life and death, was more than a person. She was a story. A complex, tragic, and unfinished one, and as her legacy faded into both inspiration and scandal, those who knew her, or thought they did, would never stop asking one question: who was Sarah Collins really?